Welcome back, everyone. So this week we're getting into topic 3, the building blocks of life. So in topic 3, we're going to basically kind of go backwards. So we've already talked about what the components of cells are. So we've talked about, what makes a cell, the properties of life, as well as the components of the cells, the different organelles. So now we're going to look at what makes up a cell. So we're going to be looking at the macromolecules. And we're going to be looking at the specific types of biological macromolecules in living things and how, what functions they serve and so forth. So we're going to explore those building blocks of life in this topic 3, okay? So we're going to start out with the first section of our topic 3 in our Adigia textbook, looking at how does the cell membrane work. So we're going to focus in on the cell membrane. So we have 4 learning objectives that we're going to cover in this video. So the first one, describe the fluid mosaic model of membranes. So we're going to talk about basically what the cell membrane looks like, what this fluid mosaic model means. And then we're going to look at the functions of the phospholipids, proteins, and carbohydrates that make up the membrane. And then we're going to discuss the location and importance of cell membrane receptor molecules, as well as define hydrophilic and hydrophobic, which we already defined in last week, topic 2. So that should be a refresher for you. Okay, and as always, it's a good idea to write these learning objectives down, and then at the end of the video, see if you can write the answers to them just as a recall from memory following the video. So let's start out by talking about just an overview of how the membrane works. Okay, so first off, what is the purpose of our cell membrane? So remember that the cell membrane is the boundary of the cell. So it basically keeps the inside of the cell inside and the outside of the cell outside. So it defines the boundary of the cell. It's also, another purpose of it is it controls what goes in and out of the cell. So it's semi-permeable. So it allows certain things to go into the cell that should go into the cell, but it keeps other things from going in, okay? It also allows things that are produced in the cell to go out of the cell. So any waste products that are produced, or certain things that have been produced on purpose, like hormones or whatever, to be excreted from the cell. Another thing we need to know about the cell membrane is that it is not solid. It is fluid and it's dynamic. Okay, so it's not just this static bag that's just sitting there. So it is dynamic, it's constantly in flux, so it's constantly moving and forming and reforming over and over again. All right? And it also carries markers, okay? So this allows cells to be able to recognize one another. So we talked about last week in topic 2 that cells need to be able to attach to one another, okay? So they need to distinguish each other to be able to form tissues. So cells, clumps of cells form tissues, and then tissues form organs, and organs form organ systems, and so forth. So they have markers on them to be able to recognize each other and be able to form tissues, okay? They also need to have markers to be able to form, distinguish each other and be able to recognize each other as, a good cell versus a bad, something that could harm them. And then finally, plasma membranes, they carry receptors. So we talked a little bit about receptors when we talked about viruses. So attached to the cell membrane are receptor sites, and they are specific attachment sites for specific substances. So those attachment sites will attract certain substances that the cell needs. Okay, so if a cell needs a specific protein, it has a specific receptor site for that protein, or a neurotransmitter or hormone, whatever. So it has a specific receptor site. And that's when we talked about how the virus has tricked the cell by having the same receptor, and so it can attach to the receptor site of the cell by mimicking that same receptor. So that's how it enters the cell. It kind of tricks the cell. But plasma membranes have these receptor sites where it basically has an attachment for a certain substance that it wants to interact with the cell. Okay? So that's the purpose of the cell membrane. So let's talk about the structure of the cell membrane. So the cell membrane, we call it the fluid mosaic model. So the reason why we call it a fluid mosaic model is because, first off, it is fluid, okay? So it's constantly forming and reforming over and over again. And then the second part, mosaic. So that means that it is a mosaic of different components, okay? So let's talk about that. So first off, let's talk about the components of the cell membrane. So it's not just made of one thing. If you notice in this picture, it's made of a lot of things. So we have, first off, the phospholipid bilayer. So we have the phospholipids, so that's like the phosphate group with the lipids, the fatty acid chain. So we have two layers of that. Here's one layer, here's the other layer. So we have the phospholipid bilayer. Okay, so that's one of the components that make up our cell membrane. We also have cholesterol. So you can see the cholesterol that is integrated within the phospholipid bilayer. We also have proteins. So you can see the proteins, some of them are embedded within the bilayer, some of them are attached to the surface of the bilayer. And then finally we have carbohydrates. So the carbohydrates are attached to the bilayer, or excuse me, they're attached to the surface. So those are, various components that make up the cell membrane. So that's the mosaic part. So there's, a mosaic of components that make up the plasma membrane. It's just not one component, it's a variety of components. And then the fluid part being that the components are able to flow and change position while maintaining the basic integrity of the membrane. So these phospholipids, for example, they're not stuck together with glue, okay? They're not going to be static. They're constantly like moving around. So they're, changing places, moving around. This whole thing is kind of bubbling up and down. It's all constantly moving. So it's fluid in nature, but it does kind of maintain a basic integrity of the membrane. So it's not like floating around in space, everything going off in one opposite directions. So they're all kind of staying together, but they're not glued together. So let's talk about the phospholipids parts of the fluid mosaic model, or the cell membrane. So we have two layers of phospholipids. So we already talked a little bit about the phospholipids last week. So the phospholipids, they have the phosphate group, which is the head, or in this case, it's those little orange balls. And these orange balls, the phosphate heads, are polar. And if you remember a polar molecule means that it is going to be attracted to water, or hydrophilic. Okay, so hydrophilic means water liking or loving. So polar means hydrophilic. So the little ball part, the phosphate heads, are going to be, basically they're going to be okay with water. And so they're going to be on the outside and inside portions of the cell. Okay. The inside of the interior part of the membrane, you can see, is where the tails are. So these tails are the fatty acids. Okay, so the phospholipid, the lipid part, the fatty acid parts are kind of facing each other. And so the lipids, they're nonpolar. And since they're nonpolar, they're hydrophobic. And because they're hydrophobic, they don't want anything to do with the liquid inside or outside of the cell. So they're going to be kind of spaced, facing each other to avoid the liquid inside and outside of the cell. So that kind of helps maintain the structure of the membrane, because of course these are hydrophobic. Okay, so they're going to be facing each other to avoid contact with the liquid of, the outside and inside of the cell. All right, so that's our phospholipid bilayer. Okay, so that's all that orange part of the cell here, cell membrane. Next, we have other components of our fluid mosaic model. So we talked about like the cholesterol, the proteins, and the carbohydrates. So embedded within the phospholipid bilayer, we have cholesterol. And what cholesterol does is it just kind of regulates the fluidity of the membrane. So it kind of helps stabilize it a bit so that it's not, it's still fluid, but it's not like really, really fluid where it's constantly like moving to the point where it's chaos and like kind of falling apart. So it does help maintain the structure of the membrane. And we'll actually see in cells of, especially like fish that live in cold lakes, we will see those type of fish, they actually have more cholesterol in their plasma membranes, because the cholesterol acts as like an antifreeze. Okay, so it actually it actually keeps the fluid or the plasma membrane more stable, and so that it doesn't freeze. So cholesterol acts as this antifreeze in cold climates, but it also just helps maintain the fluidity of the membrane to help stabilize it. We also notice we have these proteins. Okay, so the proteins, we have two types. We have integral proteins. So the integral proteins are embedded within the layer. Okay, so you can see there's different ones, and you can see that they kind of form channels. So they allow certain substances to go through the membrane. Okay, so there's channels, protein channels. We also have peripheral proteins, so they are kind of embedded on the surface. So they could be on the exterior surface or on the interior surface of the membrane. Okay, so those are another component of our mosaic of our membrane. And then finally we have the carbohydrates. So the carbohydrates are only found on the exterior surface of our cell membrane, and they're usually bound to something else. So they could be bound to a protein, and if they're bound to a protein, we call it a glycoprotein. So glyco means carbohydrate, so glycoprotein. So there's one attached to a peripheral protein, so it's a glycoprotein. Or it could be attached to a lipid. So here's one attached to some lipid, and so it's a glycolipid. Okay? So those are the other components that make up our cell membrane. All right, so let's do a couple review questions on our plasma membrane. So which plasma membrane component can be either found on its surface or embedded in the membrane structure? Is it A, carbohydrate, B, phospholipid, C, cholesterol, or D, protein? So which one of these can be either embedded within the membrane or on its surface? If you chose the protein, I would agree with you. So remember, with proteins, we have the integral proteins that are embedded within the membrane, as well as the peripheral proteins that are found on the surface. And then finally, we have the tails of the phospholipids of the plasma membrane are composed of blank and are blank. So fill in the blanks. Are they composed of phosphate groups or fatty acid groups? So are these tails phosphates or fatty acids? If you chose fatty acids, I would agree with you. So it's either B or C. And are fatty acids, are they hydrophobic or hydrophilic? If you chose hydrophobic, I would agree with you. So remember, lipids, they are non-polar, they're hydrophobic. They don't want to interact with water because they're not polar. Okay, so the correct answer would be C. All right. So that's it for this first section. So we have finished the first section of topic 3 of our Adigia textbook. So by now you should be able to describe the fluid mosaic model of membranes. You should be able to describe the functions of the phospholipids as well as the proteins and the carbohydrates in the membranes. You should also be able to discuss the location and importance of cell membrane receptor molecules, as well as define hydrophilic and hydrophobic. So for our next video, we will talk about passive transport.